When people hear DNA in court, it all gets meshed together into one big idea. The science says it's him. But in reality, there are at least 4 different scientific tools in play, and they're each answering different questions. Likelihood ratios, transfer, persistence, prevalence, recovery, TPPR, activity level propositions, thresholds, and dropout. When a courtroom acts like they're all answering the same question, did the defendant do it? That's where the danger starts. 1. Likelihood ratios. Who's the source? An LR is usually built at the source level. How much more likely is this DNA profile if it came from the defendant rather than some unrelated person? That's a narrow identity question. It can give you a big number about who is most likely a contributor to this trace. What it does not tell you is how the DNA got there, when it was deposited, or what role the object played in the crime. Number 2, TPPR. How does DNA behave in the real world? Transfer, persistence, prevalence, recovery are the parts that answer. How easily does this DNA move? How long does it stick around? How common is background DNA like this? How likely is it we'd detect it under these conditions? How does it behave on this surface or that surface? TPPR is what you need for trace DNA to say, could this be old contact? Could this be secondary transfer? How much does normal background DNA on this kind of item muddy the picture? Without TPPR, your activity level story is basically vibes. Number 3, activity level. How and when did the DNA get there? Activity level propositions ask, under which scenario is the DNA most likely? For example, hypothesis 1, he touched the sheath during the killings. Hypothesis 2, his DNA got on the sheath some other way, earlier through transfer. This is where the real case question lives in trace DNA. Was this DNA crime related? Or background? Or lab handling transfer noise issue? Most state labs don't formally model this. They report the likelihood ratio for who. The courtroom quietly treats it like an answer to how and when. Number 4, thresholds and dropout. Do we even trust this profile? Thresholds are the cutoffs. How low is too low to call a peak real? When do we say a profile is interpretable versus too weak? With trace DNA, we're often right at those limits, seeing alleles drop out, sometimes seeing random drop in, needing reruns, reinjections, pushed conditions. Once a profile clears a threshold, all of that fragility tends to disappear from the story, but it's still a part of what the evidence actually means. Where it goes wrong. Individually, these tools are scientific. The likelihood ratio, LR. Who, TPPR. How DNA behaves. Activity level. How, when did the DNA get there? Thresholds. Is this even a usable signal? The problem is what happens when they arrive in court and get collapsed into one idea. We have a DNA match with an octillion-level statistic. Therefore, he was there with this object doing this thing at this time. That's not what the LR alone does. That's not what thresholds guarantee. And TPPR plus activity level often haven't really been done. They're just assumed. In a trace DNA capital case, that collapse is a recipe for a wrongful conviction. The likelihood ratio is answering who, while the real fight is about how, when, and what this object actually means. So here's the glitch. 4 different tools are answering 4 different questions, but the court often treats them as if they all say the same thing. He did it. And You can really see this disconnect when you look at something most people skim right past: failed runs in the paperwork. When you see in a lab that the first and second runs after extraction failed, it's not a tiny footnote. That's the system telling you something important about the sample. Multiple post extraction failures, failed quant standards, amplification failures, ILS failures, the works, usually means three things. You're right near the detection or validation threshold. The system itself has already said at least twice, this run isn't good enough. And only after pushing it, changing settings, re-injecting, tweaking conditions, did it finally yield a profile. So the final profile isn't living in a nice, stable, high template world of a big blood stain. It's sitting on the edge of what the system is comfortable with. That's what I mean when I call it a fragile signal. Now, how does that connect to thresholds and the likelihood ratio? Those early failed runs are basically thresholds in action. The lab's validation rules and quality checks did their job. They stopped those first runs because the standards or the ILS didn't behave. That part is good science. But the moment they finally squeeze out a run that passes quality control, the story jumps straight to, we have a valid profile, a very strong likelihood ratio. What tends to disappear from the courtroom narrative is, how many times did the system had to say no first? How close this sample was to the edge of interpretability? And how much dropout and drop-in risk that implies. The likelihood calculation itself doesn't see any of that history. It just sees the final allele calls that it's given. So you end up with a mathematically clean number sitting on top of a lab process that clearly struggled to get there. That's the connection. Failed early runs equal the evidence lives in a fragile zone. But the likelihood ratio is presented like it came from a robust zone. For trace DNA, those early failures are also a giant TPPR flag: transfer, persistence, prevalence, and recovery. If you only get a whisper of a profile after pushing, that suggests you're looking at a tiny patch of DNA, not a big clear deposit. Tiny patches are more vulnerable to odd transfer routes, weird patchiness on the surface, and plain background noise or chance events. On the persistence and recovery side, needing multiple attempts just to recover a profile at all tells you this is not a huge, robust deposit that screams fresh event. It's something the system struggles to consistently pull out. And at the activity level, that means a lot. It becomes harder to say with a straight face, this is definitely crime event DNA, not background, not old contact, not some other kind of transfer. The more fragile and borderline the signal is, the more live alternative stories there are for how and when it got there. So yes, the failed steps absolutely connect back to the bigger picture. Fragile runs, borderline thresholds, more TPPR uncertainty, activity level questions even more open. While the likelihood ratio is still being used like a big, simple answer. So, when the first and second runs after extraction fail, the system telling you this is a fragile, borderline trace sample. The final likelihood ratio might look clean, but it's perched on top of a process that had to say no to itself more than once. And that fragility matters for how we think about transfer, persistence, and what story this DNA can honestly carry in a capital case.